Hey indie filmmakers, Griffin here. Today I am running some side-by-side tests between the new Panasonic GH4 and its predecessor, the GH3. I've been using this line of cameras for 4 years now, starting with the GH1. I'm filming this shot right now with the GH2. I shot my documentary, Sriracha, on the GH3, and now I have a 4K camera with the GH4. So today I will show you everything that Panasonic has improved with the GH4 on what was already a really great camera, the GH3. They share the same splash and dust-proof body with a strong magnesium alloy skeleton. Same mic jack, headphone jack, and same awesome batteries. On the GH3, I can literally shoot an entire day on one battery. The main reason I got the GH4 is because it's so similar to the GH3. Now I have two nearly identical cameras that use the same batteries, so I can probably get rid of my GH2, which has a different body design and a smaller battery. Only a few physical changes to the exterior of the GH4. Panasonic added a mode dial lock. I'm not sure why, because I've never accidentally bumped my dial into the wrong position. They switched it from mini HDMI on the GH3 to micro HDMI, or Type D, added a connector for the optional $2,000 interface unit, gave it a bigger eyepiece, and gave it sharper displays, with 60% more pixels on the LCD and 30% more on the viewfinder. And the GH4 is heavier by 4 pennies. So on the outside, these cameras are practically the same. The real differences are inside. And besides just 4K, I'm wondering, with its faster processor, how does it do in low light, and with Moire and rolling shutter? So to get to the bottom of all of these questions that I have about the GH4, I've mounted my GH3 side by side with my GH4. I've given them the same 12 to 35mm lens, and I've set all the settings exactly the same way. Pause for a second. Both cameras are set to 5000 Kelvin white balance, but the GH4 definitely looks more yellow. I found that across all of my side-by-side tests. The GH4 has a warmer image, and that's just something I'll need to account for. Right away, we notice that the crop factor on both these cameras is identical. They have the same shape and size sensor. But here's where they get a little bit weird. Right now I'm shooting in 1080 and they look the same. But if I change the camera, here's what it looks like now in 4K. You can see that it's a little bit tighter down on me. Now, that doesn't make much sense, right? Because 4K is actually a larger resolution. So why is it using less of the sensor? Here's what's happening. If you take a photo with this 16 megapixel sensor, it's 4,608 pixels wide, and you notice the 4:3 aspect ratio. That's the shape of this sensor. And when you shoot 1080 HD video, the camera uses the entire width of that sensor, and then downscales it, throwing out more than half of the pixels because the final image only needs to be 1920 pixels across. But when you shoot in 4K, that's twice as wide and twice as tall as 1080. It fills most of the sensor. And it's better quality to use only the pixels we need, rather than the entire sensor and downscaling. That's why the 4K crop factor is tighter than in 1080 mode. This 1-to-1 pixel mapping on the sensor also means less moire. Moire is that dancing line pattern that occurs when tight lines on the video interfere with the pixel pattern of the sensor. But by shooting in 4K, even when I'm editing in 1080, there's no moire. I find that when both cameras are shooting 1080, the detail looks the same. But if I shoot in 4K and edit in 1080, the footage, even though it's downscaled, looks significantly sharper. So even if all of my videos are in 1080, it still makes sense to shoot in 4K. Another reason to shoot in 4K while editing in 1080 is the ability to punch in up to 200% without losing resolution. But there is one downside to 4K on the GH4. Rolling shutter is worse. When shooting in 1080, the GH3 and GH4 have the same amount of rolling shutter. But because of that crop factor in 4K, the rolling shutter effect is exaggerated. Although personally, I really don't think rolling shutter is a big deal. Doesn't bother me. But the GH4 does beat the GH3 in high ISO. When I'm shooting in low light, the GH4 is less noisy than the GH3 at 1600 ISO, 3200 ISO, and 6400 ISO. The GH4 also adds some additional photo styles. I often use the natural photo style on the GH3.
I don't share my loved one for anyone.
But Panasonic has added a couple styles aimed at filmmakers: Cine-like D and Cine-like V. They've also added a couple settings, master pedestal level and highlight shadow, that allow you to lower the highlights and raise the shadows to lessen contrast and increase dynamic range. This will result in a flatter image, but it provides more leeway in color correction. Another improvement the GH4 brings is even slower slow motion. The GH3 maxes out at 60 frames per second in 1080. That's 40% slow motion if you play it back at 24 frames per second. The new GH4 can record up to 96 frames per second in 1080, which is 25% slow motion. But this super slow-mo comes at a price. The sharpness appears to be worse than the GH3. Plus, you don't get audio or autofocus while recording in this variable frame rate mode on the GH4. Let's talk about focus. The big thing that Panasonic finally added that so many video people wanted is focus peaking. When you're in manual focus, the camera helps show you what's in focus by highlighting it with color. When you turn the focus ring before recording, the GH4 will magnify the image to help you focus. But just like on the GH3, it won't do this while recording, so having focus peaking is really helpful, especially with all manual lenses. Alright, facial focus test. If I come in sideways, will it recognize me as a human face? Oh yeah, I think it's got me. Hello, is it focusing? Panasonic says the GH4 features a new high-speed autofocus, and yet in my testing, side by side, the GH3 achieves focus faster. I love the Panasonic GH3, but it does have some annoying quirks that I am so happy Panasonic fixed with the GH4. On the GH3, even if your economy settings tell the monitor never to go to sleep, the display items disappear after 10 seconds, and most of the buttons go to sleep. This means if you hit the video recording button, all it does is wake up the display. You have to hit it a second time to actually record. I've learned to live with this, but I know I've missed shots because of it. Fortunately, on the GH4, the display items stay on the screen, and the record button works just fine. Another weird GH3 issue, it doesn't record audio for the first 2 or 3 frames of a video. And worse, the last second of each file just gets cut off. It's like it backtracks, it stops recording a second before you hit the button to stop it. So with a stopwatch, I started recording on both cameras at the 5-second mark, and then stopped at the 15-second mark. After syncing these two clips, it looks like Panasonic solved the audio gap problem by delaying video recording by a couple frames. That's great. I'd prefer a barely slower response time if it means consistent audio. And better yet, the GH4 does not chop off the last second of each clip. The whole thing is there. Although each camera still drops 1 frame of audio at the very end. Other improvements, the GH4 works even better over Wi-Fi. Both cameras can be controlled by an iOS or Android device, but once you activate recording on the GH3, you pretty much lose all connection. There's no live preview and you can't stop recording. With the GH4, you can actually use a wireless device as a monitor and a remote to start and stop recording.
Stop recording?
When Panasonic made the GH3, they shipped 2 different models, an NTSC version and a PAL version. And because of European tax code, the PAL version couldn't shoot longer than 29 minutes 59 seconds. But with the GH4, there's just one version that can switch between PAL, NTSC, and cinema mode. I just tested the GH4, and even in PAL mode, there is no recording limit. And the cinema mode on the GH4 is where you find the Cinema 4K mode, which is slightly wider than a 16:9 aspect ratio. Plus, cinema mode records in 24 progressive frames per second, just like film, not 23.98 frames per second like television. Finally, let's talk about SD cards and bit rates. The GH3 could record up to 72 megabits per second. That's 9 megabytes every second. Every 4K mode on the GH4 is 100 megabits per second. The GH4 can shoot 1080 in lots of bit rates, anywhere from 17 to 200 megabits per second, depending on how big you want your files. Frankly, I could not see the difference between shooting 1080 at 200 megabits per second versus 50 megabits. And you'd expect the 200 megabit recording to be 4 times bigger, but actually many of my 200 megabit recordings were smaller, with actual bit rates less than 50 megabits per second. That's because the 200 megabit mode uses a different codec, All-I, which compresses every frame individually. So if you're not filming something that really pushes the data rate, the file will just end up smaller. To capture these video files, Panasonic recommends a UHS Speed Class 3 SD card. But I've been doing just fine with a UHS Speed Class 1 card, the SanDisk Extreme 64GB. It says 80 megabytes per second, which is its top read speed. When I test it, it writes data at 40 megabytes per second. That's 320 megabits per second, so in theory, it should be plenty fast for the GH4. Even my Transcend 16GB Class 10 card writes around 15 megabytes per second. And as hard as I tried, I could only make it fail once, while the GH4 recorded in its highest bitrate. So before you go out and buy an expensive new SD card, you might as well at least try the ones you already have. And remember, you don't have to shoot in the GH4's highest bit rates. You could save some space on your computer. Speaking of buying stuff, the price tag on the GH4 is $1,700. That's $400 more than the GH3 when it first came out. But nowadays, the GH3 sells for under $1,000. If you want 4K and slow motion at 96 frames per second, clearly you'll spend the extra $700 on the Panasonic GH4. They've fixed a few tiny issues, they've added several great new features like focus peaking, but really most of what makes this a great camera is already in the Panasonic GH3. So I gotta say, it's hard to go wrong with either of these choices. I'll be keeping both of them and shooting with both of them from here on out. If you're interested in either of these cameras, be sure to click this link right here. It's a link to all the video equipment I use. You can see everything I use. And just by clicking this, or on the link in the video description, you're actually helping to support the channel. Let me know what other camera questions you have in the comments below. If you want more GH4 content, I also have this unboxing video and this video where I show you all of the settings on the GH4 that filmmakers need to know. Thanks for watching, everyone.